You need to leave my mother alone. The words hit Margaret Ashford like a fist to the chest. She was standing right there, in her own kitchen, at her own table, holding a coffee cup she had poured herself, when Eleanor Whitmore walked through the unlocked front door without so much as a knock. The woman was 41 years old and dressed like she was attending a funeral, which Margaret supposed was exactly how Eleanor viewed this visit. "Excuse me?" Margaret set the cup down, carefully. "My father is a grieving man." Eleanor's voice was controlled, rehearsed, the kind of voice that had practiced this speech in a wagon mirror somewhere between Billings and here. "He is not thinking clearly, and women like you—" She stopped herself, smiled tightly. "Women your age tend to misread simple kindness for something it isn't. Women your age." 3 words. That's all it took to collapse 7 years of work, 7 years of surviving, into something small enough to dismiss. If you were sitting in Margaret's chair right now, if someone walked into the home you built with your bare hands and told you that your heart no longer had the right to feel anything, what would you do? Stay with us, because what Margaret does next will change everything. If this story already has your heart, subscribe right now. Hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. These stories deserve to be heard. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The fence had been broken for 3 weeks before Margaret allowed herself to admit she couldn't fix it alone. That was the kind of woman she was. The kind who would look at a problem for 21 days, measure it from every angle, attempt it twice in the wrong weather, and only surrender the idea of doing it herself when the alternative became genuinely dangerous. Not inconvenient, dangerous. There was a difference, and Margaret Ashford knew exactly where that line sat. She had learned the difference the hard way, 7 years ago, the morning she found her husband Robert lying in the south pasture with his hand still holding the fence pliers he'd been using when his heart simply stopped. The doctor said it was fast. Margaret had always been grateful for that, and guilty about the gratitude in equal measure. Fast for Robert meant slow for her, a slow unraveling of every plan they had made together, every assumption about how the rest of her life was supposed to go. She was 46 when she buried him. 46 and alone on 90 acres of Montana territory with 2 horses, 37 head of cattle, a barn that needed a new roof, and a community of kind-hearted people who looked at her like she was already halfway to being a memory. 7 years later, she was 53, and she had kept every single one of those animals alive, replaced the barn roof herself with help from the Henderson boys one summer, and she had learned to do things Robert had never once asked her to do. She learned to read a storm by the color of the western sky. She learned which boards in the stable floor would hold and which ones wouldn't. She learned to sharpen her own tools, read her own accounts, and negotiate her own prices at the grain exchange in town, where men twice her size still occasionally tried to give her the widow rate until she corrected them, quietly, and only once. She was not a woman who complained. She was not even a woman who admitted difficulty, most of the time. So when the northwest fence line buckled under a September windstorm, and she spent 3 mornings attempting to reset the posts herself, and each morning failed, and the cattle began drifting toward the open section, she finally did the thing she hated most. She asked for help. She sent word to Hale Henderson's oldest son, figuring he owed her a favor from last spring. What she got instead, 2 mornings later, was Silas Whitmore. She didn't know him well. She knew of him. Everyone in the valley knew of him. His ranch sat 4 miles northeast, a bigger operation than hers, more hands, more acreage. He had lost his wife, Clara, 3 years back. Consumption, people said, though no one spoke of it directly in front of him. He was 57 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that had softened some with age, with the kind of quietness that came not from having nothing to say, but from having learned long ago to choose carefully what to spend words on. He arrived at her gate just after 7 in the morning, his wagon carrying a roll of new wire, a post hole digger, and a small wooden crate she couldn't identify from the porch. He climbed down without hurrying, tied his horse with practiced economy, and walked toward her with his hat in his hand. Not in a formal way. More like he'd taken it off because the morning was cool, and he'd been holding it since he left home. "Mrs. Ashford." He nodded once. "Tom Henderson said you had a fence down on the northwest line." "I do." She crossed her arms, not defensively, just the way she stood when she was outdoors in the cold. I was expecting Tom's boy. He had something come up. Silas paused. I was heading this direction anyway. She knew that was likely not entirely true. His ranch was northeast. Her northwest fence line was the furthest possible point from his property. But she recognized the courtesy in the lie, the way it was designed to let her accept help without the weight of obligation, and she appreciated it enough not to challenge it. I'll show you where it is, she said. He followed her on foot across the property, and she noticed he didn't try to fill the walk with conversation. Most people who came to help her talked too much, cheerful, overcompensating talk that was really just their discomfort with her situation dressed up as friendliness. Silas walked beside her and looked at the land the way a person looks at something they respect. When they reached the broken section, he crouched down, examined the posts, pressed one with his palm to test the soil, and said, without looking up, "Ground's still soft from the August rains. That's why they pulled loose. We'll need to go deeper." We. The word surprised her. Not, "I'll fix it," or "I can handle this." We. "I know how to hold a post," she said. Good. He stood. Then we'll get it done faster. They worked for 4 hours. Margaret held posts, passed wire, and fetched the tools from his wagon when needed, and at no point did Silas Whitmore suggest she rest, stand back, or let him manage it. He worked the way she worked, steadily, without drama, stopping only to assess what came next. By mid-morning, she had forgotten to feel awkward about his presence. When they finished, she offered coffee. It seemed the only reasonable thing to do. She expected him to decline. Men always declined. They had somewhere to be, something to get back to. A polite fiction of urgency that protected both sides from the discomfort of sitting still together. Silas said, "If it's no trouble," and followed her inside. They sat at her kitchen table with coffee she'd made strong out of habit, and he told her his fence had blown down too, 2 weeks ago, and that it had taken him and 2 of his hands 3 days to fully repair it. He said it without complaint, just the flat accounting of a man who had learned to factor setbacks into his calculations. She told him she'd spent 3 mornings on hers before admitting defeat. She said it as a fact, not an apology. He looked at her across the table and said, 3 mornings on ground like that by yourself, without a second pair of hands, that's not defeat. That's the wrong situation. She didn't answer immediately. It was such a direct thing to say, and so precisely aimed at the thing she'd been calling failure for 3 weeks, that she needed a moment to decide what to do with it. "People around here think I should have sold after Robert died," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. It came out the way things sometimes did when she was tired, unguarded, unplanned. Silas wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "People around here say a lot of things they haven't earned the right to say." Something in Margaret's chest shifted, almost imperceptibly. Not dramatically, not the way stories described such moments, with sudden warmth or rushing feeling. More like a door that had been closed so long it had started to seem like a wall, and someone had simply touched the handle. She refilled his coffee without asking. He stayed another hour. They talked about the coming winter, about the grain prices, about a dispute between 2 other ranchers she only knew vaguely. Normal conversation. The kind she'd had dozens of times with dozens of neighbors. But there was something different in the texture of it. The way he asked her opinion as though he expected it to be worth something. The way he listened when she gave it, which wasn't the same as the polite listening people offered when they were waiting for their turn to speak again. When he stood to leave, he picked up his hat and said, "I've got extra firewood cut. More than I need before winter. I'll bring some by next week if you're willing." She should have said that's not necessary. It was on the tip of her tongue, that reliable deflection she had refined into a reflex over 7 years. "All right," she said instead. She watched his wagon until it disappeared past the tree line. Then she stood alone in her kitchen, which was exactly what she had been doing for 7 years, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not loneliness. She knew loneliness well enough to name it on sight. This was something else, something quieter and more dangerous. Hope. She pushed it back down immediately. She was 53 years old and she had a ranch to run and winter coming and 47 things that needed doing before the first hard freeze. She did not have time for the particular kind of foolishness that came from one man being unexpectedly decent over a broken fence and a cup of coffee. By the following Thursday, she had nearly convinced herself of that. Then Silas arrived with the firewood. He brought more than she expected, 2 full cords, split clean, stacked in his wagon, with a precision that suggested he'd done it himself rather than leaving it to a hired hand. He carried it to the side of her house where the woodpile lived and stacked it without being told where she kept it, because he'd noticed on his first visit without appearing to look. Margaret noticed that he had noticed. She said nothing about it. They had coffee again, an hour again, maybe slightly longer. This time he told her something about Clara. Just a small thing, how she had refused to learn to bake bread because she said it was a waste of her time, and she'd rather spend an hour reading, and how he'd eaten store-bought bread for 12 years rather than challenge her on it, and how he still bought it sometimes from the baker in town, even though he had no reason to anymore. He said it with the kind of wry, tired affection that doesn't come from fresh grief. It came from grief that had been lived with long enough to be understood. Margaret told him that Robert had never learned to fix a gate latch. In 41 years of ranching, he had fixed hundreds of complicated things, but a simple gate latch defeated him every time. She'd replaced the same latch on the south gate 4 times during their marriage, and each time he looked genuinely surprised that it had happened again. Silas laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one. It was such an uncomplicated sound that Margaret sat with it for a moment after it faded, surprised by how much she'd needed to hear it. 2 weeks after the firewood, he sent 2 of his ranch hands to help reshingle the damaged section of her barn roof. He sent a note with them explaining that they were between jobs and he was paying them either way, so it was no imposition. It was a careful note. He had clearly written it, understanding that she would need a way to accept the help that didn't make her feel diminished by it. She let them do the work. She fed them lunch and paid them a fair wage from her own pocket, which Silas had quietly anticipated by underpaying them that morning, though she didn't learn that until much later. The town started talking around the 4th visit. Margaret heard it first from Dora Calloway, her nearest neighbor to the south, who stopped by ostensibly to return a borrowed bread pan and stayed 40 minutes. Dora was a kind woman who meant almost everything she said in the best possible way, and that made the bad moments worse rather than better, because they came wrapped in genuine warmth. "People have noticed Silas Whitmore coming around," Dora said, over her second cup of tea. "I think it's lovely that he's been helpful. It really is." She paused in a way that indicated the next sentence was the actual point of the visit. "But you know how people talk, and I'd hate for anyone to get the wrong idea, or the wrong expectations." "What wrong expectations would those be?" Margaret asked. Dora's hands moved around her teacup. "Well, you're both at a certain age where these things can be misread by both parties. I just think it's worth being careful, being sensible." She smiled, gently, catastrophically. "You've managed so beautifully on your own, Margaret. That's something to be proud of. You don't need to complicate it." "You don't need to complicate it," said to a 53-year-old woman as though complication was a rookie mistake she might accidentally make. Margaret thanked Dora for returning the pan. After she left, Margaret stood at the kitchen window and looked at the firewood stacked neatly against the side of her house, and she asked herself, as honestly as she could manage, what it was she thought was happening, what she thought she wanted. The answer she got back was not clean or comfortable. It was the answer of a woman who had been telling herself one story for 7 years and had suddenly developed doubts about the ending. She didn't want to be rescued. She was clear about that. She didn't want to be managed or guided or folded into someone else's life in a way that erased the shape of her own. But she was tired. Not of the work. She had made her peace with the work years ago. She was tired of every meal eaten in silence, and every decision carrying no further than her own ears, and every small victory won in the presence of no one who might say well done. She was tired of being admired for surviving by people who would have preferred she do it more quietly and ask less of the space she occupied. She was tired of being told, in the careful, kind language of people who meant well, that her life had already reached its most important chapters. She was 53, not 90, not finished. But knowing that and believing it turned out to be 2 entirely different things. She was still standing at that window, working on the distance between knowing and believing, when she heard a horse at her gate. She turned, looked out. Silas Whitmore. Again. Earlier than expected, unannounced, standing at her fence with something in his hand that looked like it might be a jar of apple preserves, looking up at her house in the tentative way of a man who was not entirely sure of his welcome and had come anyway. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something she had not planned to do. She smiled. A real one. The unguarded, unwidowed kind that she had nearly forgotten lived in her face. And she went to open the door. She didn't know yet what was coming. The gossip that would sharpen into cruelty. The daughter who would arrive with rehearsed words and narrowed eyes. The winter that would nearly take her before she let anyone see her fall. She didn't know any of it yet. She only knew that the man at her gate had brought apple preserves on a Tuesday morning for no particular reason, and that her chest felt like something long frozen had begun, very slowly, to thaw. And that frightened her more than any Montana winter ever had. The apple preserves were better than anything Margaret had made in years. She didn't tell Silas that. She put the jar on the kitchen shelf and thanked him with the same measured politeness she used for everything, the kind that gave nothing away, and he nodded and didn't push for more. That was the thing she kept noticing about him. He didn't push. He came, he offered, he stayed as long as was reasonable, and then he left without making her feel like she owed him a debt she hadn't agreed to carry. She opened the preserves 3 days later, on a Sunday morning when she had nothing particular to do, and the silence in the house had its usual Sunday weight. She spread them on 2 slices of bread and stood at the counter eating alone, and they were sweet and sharp at the same time, the kind of flavor that asks something of you. And she thought about the fact that a man who made preserves like that had been living 4 miles away for 3 years, and she had never once thought to know him better. That realization unsettled her more than she expected. October moved in the way Montana Octobers did. Not gradually, not with warning, but with sudden authority, as if summer had simply decided it was done with the conversation. The mornings turned hard and the afternoons were short, and everything on the ranch demanded attention at once, in the particular way of a season that was preparing to close. Margaret was good at October. She had a system, built over years, for what got done in what order, and she moved through the days with the efficient tiredness of a person who knows exactly how much work is ahead and has made peace with it. The cattle were moved to the closer pasture. The root cellar was inventoried and the gaps filled. The window frames were recaulked. The tools were cleaned and properly stored before the cold could get into them. She was mending a split in her older work saddle one afternoon, sitting on the bench outside the stable in the last of the day's warmth, when she heard wheels on the track and looked up to find Silas's wagon coming through the gate. She hadn't expected him. He'd been by 6 days ago, long enough that another visit didn't feel presumptuous, but she still hadn't let herself anticipate it. That felt important, not anticipating. It felt like the kind of boundary a sensible woman held. He climbed down and came across the yard toward her, and she noticed he'd brought nothing this time. No wire, no wood, no jar of something. Just himself, in his working coat, with the particular look of a man who had made a decision and was living with the uncertainty of it. "I was in the area," he said. "Your ranch is northeast," she said, a beat. "I took the long way." She didn't smile, but it was an effort. She moved the saddlework slightly to her left, which was not an invitation but was not the opposite of one either, and after a moment he sat down on the far end of the bench with about 2 feet of space between them. "How's the northwest fence holding?" he asked. "It held through the last wind," she said. The deep setting made the difference. "Good." He looked out at the pasture. "The cattle look well." "They are." They sat in the kind of silence that had started to feel less strange with each visit, and Margaret kept working on the saddle, and eventually Silas started talking about the early frost he'd seen on the higher ground north of his property, and what it meant for the timeline of getting his remaining hay baled. And she listened and occasionally offered something, and neither of them pretended the conversation was more than what it was, which was 2 people sitting in the last warmth of an October afternoon because neither of them wanted to go inside yet. It was an hour before he left. Maybe slightly more. She didn't watch the clock. She noticed that she hadn't watched it. The second knock of gossip came from Pastor Ellery's wife, Ruth, who was not an unkind woman, but was a thorough one. She arrived mid-morning with a loaf of bread she'd baked, which Margaret recognized as a currency. Something was about to be said that required the softening of bread. "The whole town's noticed Silas Whitmore spending time out here," Ruth said, arranging her skirt on the kitchen chair with the care of a woman who was going to take her time getting to the point. "People notice most things in a town this small," Margaret said. "They're talking, Margaret." Ruth looked at her with the expression of a woman delivering unwelcome news for your own benefit. Not meanly, mostly with concern. "People worry that the 2 of you, might be developing expectations that aren't realistic at your stage of life." She hesitated. It's not that anyone thinks less of either of you. It's just that certain things become complicated when people don't think clearly about what's possible. Margaret cut 2 slices of the bread. She set one in front of Ruth. She sat down across from her. She looked at her for a moment. What stage of life is that, Ruth? Ruth's hands fluttered slightly. Well, you're past 50, both of you. You've both had full lives, good lives. It seems like perhaps what you need is friendship, companionship, not... She stopped. Started again. Not romance, not whatever comes with that. People our age have to be practical. Our age. Ruth was 48. I appreciate you coming, Margaret said. Ruth seemed to understand that the conversation was over. She ate her bread and talked about the upcoming harvest supper, and left with the slightly frustrated expression of a person who had tried to help and been politely refused, which was, Margaret had learned, one of the most irritating refusals to be on the receiving end of. After she left, Margaret stood at the kitchen table and felt the anger move through her the way cold water moved. Sudden, and then you were already wet before you'd registered it. She wasn't angry at Ruth specifically. Ruth was carrying a message she hadn't written alone. She was angry at the message, at the settled certainty behind it, at the way it assumed that the border of what she was allowed to want had been drawn without her, and she just hadn't been notified yet. She was 53. She had run 90 acres of Montana ranch for 7 years by herself. She had negotiated grain prices and replaced barn roofs and set fence posts in frost-hardened ground, and kept every animal alive through 2 of the hardest winters the territory had seen in a decade. She had done every single thing that proved a person was still capable and present and worth reckoning with, and somehow none of it counted against the one fact that everyone kept quietly returning to. She was a woman, past 50, who had already had her marriage, therefore finished. She went back outside and finished mending the saddle, and she was angrier than she'd been in a long time. And underneath the anger was something she was less willing to examine, which was fear. Not of what people thought. She had managed people's opinions before. Fear of whether they might be right. That was the thing she couldn't dismiss the way she could dismiss Ruth's bread or Dora's borrowed pan. Late at night, in the particular honesty of the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, she was forced to consider it seriously. She was 53 years old, and she was sitting at a kitchen table developing feelings for a man she had known for 6 weeks, and the entire community around her had collectively, gently, firmly told her that this was not appropriate, that she had misread things, that she should dial back her expectations before they embarrassed everyone. What if they were right? What if she was the widow who couldn't read a room? What if Silas's visits were exactly what Eleanor Whitmore would later insist they were? A man being neighborly, nothing more, and she had spun an entire private narrative around apple preserves and shared bench silences because she was lonely and hoping? She sat with that possibility. She tried it on. She turned it over and looked at it from every angle. And then she thought about the way he'd said, "We'll get it done faster," and the careful note with the barn hands, and the apple preserves brought for no particular reason on a Tuesday, and the long way around when his ranch was northeast, and she thought, no. She had spent 7 years making herself not imagine things. She was not imagining this. But knowing something and doing something about it were still 2 entirely different countries. She was standing on the border between them, squinting at the far side, and she had no map. Silas came by 3 more times in October. Each visit settled slightly more naturally into the rhythm of her week than the last, the way a piece of furniture eventually stops looking like it doesn't belong in a room and simply starts looking like it lives there. He helped her move the remaining cattle without being asked, arriving early the morning she'd planned to do it, with the barely there explanation that he'd had a hand who couldn't make it to work, and he had time on his hands. She chose not to interrogate it. They worked the cattle together for 4 hours, and she noticed that he watched how she handled the animals before assuming anything, which was more courtesy than she got from men half his age who'd been ranching half as long. After the cattle were settled, standing at the gate between the pastures, he said, without particular preamble, "Clara would have liked you." Margaret looked at him. He was looking at the pasture. "She wasn't much for people who talked around things," he said. She said it was the most exhausting habit human beings had, filling air with words that weren't the ones they meant. He paused. "You don't do that." "No," Margaret said. "I ran out of patience for it a few years back." He turned and looked at her then, and for a moment the fall light was very direct and there was no way to look anywhere that wasn't at each other. And something passed between them that had no comfortable name and didn't need one. Robert sounds like he was a solid man, Silas said, eventually. He was. He was also completely wrong about gate latches for 41 years, but a solid man overall. Silas made that sound again. That real laugh, unguarded, the kind that changed his whole face. Margaret stored it somewhere she didn't have a name for either. She thought later that that was the day she stopped trying to talk herself out of what she felt. Not because she had decided to do anything about it, just because the energy required to deny it had become greater than she could spare with winter coming. The first hard freeze arrived in the second week of November, and brought with it the particular violence of a Montana season that had been patient long enough. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 days. The ground locked solid. The cattle needed more feed, and the water troughs froze by 4 in the morning, and the days got short enough that Margaret was doing half her work in the dark. She managed. She always managed. But it was exhausting in a way that had started to accumulate differently than it used to, the kind of tired that sleep didn't fully fix, that she'd notice in her hands in the morning when they were slow to close around a cup. She was 53, and the winters had their say now in ways they hadn't at 40, and she knew it and hated knowing it and refused to mention it to anyone. Silas stopped by less frequently through November. His own ranch demanded the same brutal attention in the freeze, but he sent word twice. Once to say that he'd been told the Henderson Creek crossing would likely ice badly and she should check her south fence line before it got worse. Once to say he had extra salt block coming in from Billings if she needed it before the supplier's wagon reached her side of the valley. Both messages were practical, useful, and completely deniable as anything but neighborly. She read them twice each and replied simply that she appreciated the information. She appreciated far more than the information. She couldn't write that down and hand it to a messenger. It was the third week of November when Eleanor Whitmore came to call. Margaret had not met her before. She had seen her once, from a distance, at the harvest supper in September, a tall, composed woman in her early 40s who had her father's eyes and her mother's set of the jaw, and who had been in Billings for most of the year, managing some business her husband's family had there. She had come back for the winter, Margaret heard through the usual routes, and she had come back having heard the same rumors everyone else had been circulating. She arrived in the late morning, and she didn't knock, and that was the first thing. Margaret was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the ranch accounts, and she heard the front door, which she'd left on the latch because she was expecting the grain delivery boy later, open, and she looked up, and Eleanor Whitmore walked in. Not the door. In. The full step across the threshold, into Margaret's kitchen, as though the house was a place she had the right to enter, because the business she'd come on was important enough to override the ordinary protocols of other people's homes. "You need to leave my father alone." It was delivered cleanly, without warmth or cruelty, the way a business transaction is delivered by someone who has been practicing it. Eleanor's eyes moved around the kitchen once, quickly, taking inventory of a space she was trying to understand without admitting she was doing so. Margaret set her coffee down. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment, really looked. The kind of look that some people mistook for blankness, but was actually measurement. Eleanor didn't look away. She had come here to be looked at. She had prepared for it. "Your father is a grown man," Margaret said, 57 years old. "He's a grieving man." Eleanor moved slightly further into the kitchen, which Margaret noted without comment. "He lost my mother 3 years ago. He's not thinking with full clarity about certain things. He's vulnerable, and he doesn't recognize it, and there are women who take advantage of that." The word women landed with the exact weight Eleanor had intended it to carry. "Is that what I'm doing?" Margaret said. It was not a question. Eleanor's chin lifted. "I don't know you well enough to say what you're doing. I know what it looks like. He's been out here. How many times? 7? 8? And people are talking, and my father has responsibilities. To the ranch, to his family. He doesn't need a complication at this stage of his life." There it was again. This stage of his life. The phrase that everyone kept handing her like a folded notice, like a document she was supposed to sign acknowledging she'd received it. "What stage is that?" Margaret asked. Eleanor blinked once. She had not expected that question. She had expected either greater resistance or easier collapse. And this quiet, flat inquiry, was neither. "He's 57, she said. He's not a young man anymore. No, Margaret said. He's not. Neither am I. I'm not sure what that has to do with it. It has everything to do with it. Eleanor's composure held, but something behind it was shifting, the carefully practiced speech meeting something it hadn't rehearsed for. People their age, your age, have already had what they had. You had a husband. He had my mother. Those were your... She stopped, searched. Those were your great loves. That part of life is finished. What comes now is different. It should be quieter, simpler. You don't start over again at 53. The kitchen was very still. Margaret looked at the woman standing in it, young enough to be her daughter, certain enough in her ignorance to have traveled 4 miles in November to deliver it. And she felt something move through her that was more complex than anger. It was something older. The accumulated weight of every careful voice that had ever told her for 7 years to want less, need less, take up less space, be grateful for what she had already been given because the quota was apparently fixed and she had used hers. I think, Margaret said, that you should go. Eleanor's jaw tightened. I'm only saying what needs to be said. You've said it. Margaret stood. She was not a tall woman, but she had 7 years of open land in her posture, and it showed. Now I'm asking you to leave, politely. Once. Something in Eleanor's face shifted, the composure cracking at one edge, just slightly, feeling underneath it not cruelty but something she'd been trying to hide with the cruelty, which was fear. She was afraid for her father. That was real. The love underneath the arrogance was real. Margaret could see it, and it complicated her anger without diminishing it. Eleanor left. She pulled the door shut behind her, not with a slam but with a controlled firmness that said everything the slammed door would have said with more restraint. Margaret stood in the middle of her kitchen for a full 2 minutes without moving. Then she sat back down, picked up her coffee, cold now, and looked at the accounts she hadn't finished, and noticed that her hands were shaking slightly. Not with fear, with something that had no clean name. She didn't tell Silas about the visit, not the next day when he stopped by briefly to drop off the salt block he'd mentioned, not the week after, when they had their longest conversation yet, sitting in her kitchen while a November wind threw itself at the windows with genuine intent, talking about the early years of their marriages. The stumbling, uncertain early years, not the polished versions people kept in their memories. She told him about the first winter she and Robert had tried to manage the cattle expansion and had calculated wrong and spent February terrified they wouldn't make it. He told her about the time Clara had tried to manage the household accounts, and he'd tried to help, and they'd argued for 3 weeks about it before realizing they'd been using 2 different ledgers. They laughed about things that weren't, technically, funny. They talked about people they had lost in the frank way that people who had buried someone talked. Not around it, not with the soft language of people who hadn't been there yet, but directly, with the specific humor and specific grief that came from knowing exactly what it cost. At some point the conversation shifted, and she wasn't sure when, the way a river's current shifts without you seeing the exact moment the direction changes. They were no longer talking about Robert and Clara. They were talking about themselves, what they had made of the years since, what they thought about in the evenings. Silas said quietly, looking at his coffee rather than at her, I've been alone 3 years and I was getting used to it. I didn't want to be used to it, but I was starting to be. Margaret didn't answer right away. The wind hit the window. The lamp on the table threw its small circle of warmth. I know that feeling, she said. I've been working on getting used to it for 7. He looked up at her then, not with the face of a man about to say something significant or practiced, just looking at her, with the expression of a person who recognizes something in another person they had stopped expecting to find. I don't want to be used to it anymore, he said. I'm not sure that's wisdom or foolishness, but that's the honest truth of it. The room was quiet except for the wind outside, which had no opinion on the matter, and did not care what happened next, which Margaret found, oddly, a comfort. The world would keep going either way. The cattle would need feeding tomorrow either way. The cold would come and the spring would eventually follow, and the ranch would make its demands and she would meet them. But right now, in this kitchen, in this lamplit November evening, a man she had known for 10 weeks had said something true and was waiting, without pressure, to see what she'd do with it. She was 53 years old. She was afraid. She was tired of being afraid of wanting things she had decided she was no longer allowed to want. I don't want to be used to it either, she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was just the first honest thing she had said out loud about it, to another person. And the moment it left her, she felt simultaneously lighter and more frightened, the way a woman feels when she has set down something heavy she's been carrying so long she'd forgotten she was carrying it. Silas nodded once. He looked back at his coffee. He stayed another 30 minutes, and they talked about the salt block delivery and the state of the South Road and how badly the Henderson Creek crossing had frozen. And when he left, he said goodnight, and she said goodnight, and neither of them said anything else. But something had crossed a threshold, as quietly and irreversibly as Eleanor Whitmore walking through her front door, and Margaret knew it. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about Eleanor's voice saying, "You don't start over at 53." And she thought about Silas saying, "I don't want to be used to it anymore." And she thought about herself in the same bed 7 years ago, the night after Robert's funeral, making the silent calculation about what her life was now and what it wasn't, and agreeing because she had to agree, because the alternative was too much to hold. She was tired of that agreement. She was not, she realized, afraid of what the town thought. She had managed the town's thoughts before and come through intact. She was afraid of something simpler and more personal. She was afraid of wanting this and having it turn out to be something smaller than it seemed, and having to learn, at 53, that even modest hope was too expensive an item for her budget. That fear was the real frontier, harder than any Montana winter she had faced, and she had not yet decided whether she was brave enough to cross it. Outside, the wind kept going. The cattle in the close pasture moved and settled. The frost deepened on the ground. And Margaret Ashford lay in the dark and thought about a man who took the long way around because his ranch was northeast, and whether that counted for anything, and found that no matter how many times she tried to put the thought down in sleep, it kept sitting back up and looking at her with patient, impossible eyes. December arrived the way Margaret had come to expect all hard things to arrive, not with announcement, but with the quiet accumulation of evidence that something had already changed before you noticed it changing. The first week brought cold that was serious but manageable. The second week brought cold that was something else entirely, the kind that got into the walls of a house and stayed there, that made the horses restless in their stalls and the cattle cluster together in the pasture with the particular economy of animals that understood survival better than most people did. By the third week, the temperature had dropped far enough that the water in the troughs was freezing faster than Margaret could break it, and she was waking at 4 in the morning to do it by lantern light, her breath coming in clouds, her hands aching with a persistence that was new this year and that she refused to name. She did not tell anyone about the hands. That was the first concealment. The second concealment was larger, and it came on a Tuesday morning in the third week of December, when she was on the stable roof. The problem had started 3 days earlier. A section of roof boarding near the east corner that had taken on ice weight and pulled loose from the beam beneath it. She could see it from the ground, a slight sag that would become a serious sag, and then a collapse if she left it through the worst of the winter. She had looked at it for 3 days while the temperature stayed too low to work outside safely, and on the Tuesday morning when it climbed to something approaching reasonable, she made the decision. She should have sent for help. She knew this. The rational part of her mind that had been running this ranch for 7 years knew that a 53-year-old woman alone on a stable roof in December was not a sensible situation, no matter how many times she had done sensible things by herself. She had the Henderson boys' address. She could have sent a message the night before and had help by morning. She didn't. And the reason she didn't was something she had been examining in herself with growing unease over the past several weeks. A tightening, a kind of preemptive defensiveness that had grown directly in response to Eleanor's visit and Ruth's bread and Dora's borrowed pan and all the careful voices telling her she needed to be more realistic about what she could and couldn't manage alone. She would manage it alone. She would manage it alone precisely because people had started suggesting she couldn't, and the anger behind that decision was the most honest thing she'd felt in weeks, and also, she could see now, the most dangerous. She got onto the roof without incident. She had her tools and a length of new board she'd cut that morning, and the repair was straightforward in theory. Remove the loosened section, reset the beam beneath, replace the boarding, get down. 20 minutes, maybe 30. The work went fine for the first 15. She was on her knees on the icy surface, working steadily, and the cold was bad but manageable, and she had the loosened section off and was assessing the beam beneath it when her left knee slid. It happened in less than a second. The ice on the roof's surface was thinner than she'd tested. or she had shifted her weight wrong, or both. And her knee went and her body followed, and she tried to catch herself and caught herself wrong. And then she was on her side on the slope of the stable roof with her right arm underneath her, at an angle that sent a pain up through her shoulder, so sharp and total that she made a sound she didn't recognize as coming from herself. She lay there for a moment. The sky above her was the white gray of a Montana December, featureless, indifferent. Her shoulder was screaming. She made herself breathe through it, slow, deliberate, the way she'd taught herself to breathe through difficult things. Then she made herself move. Carefully, incrementally, testing what worked and what didn't. The shoulder was badly wrenched. She would know the full extent of it later, but right now she could move the arm, which was the important thing. Nothing had snapped. She made it to the ladder. She got down. She stood in the stable yard for a moment, breathing, holding her right arm close to her body, and took an inventory of the damage with the clinical detachment she could summon in emergencies and only in emergencies. The shoulder would be bad for days. The repair on the roof was half done and would need to be finished somehow. She had cattle to feed in 2 hours and water troughs to break in 4. She went inside and did what she could for the shoulder, cold water, then a binding she rigged herself, which was harder than it should have been, and took 3 tries with one functional arm. And then she went back out and fed the cattle. She did not send for help. She did not send a message to Silas, or to the Henderson boy, or to anyone. She finished the day, and then the next day, and then the day after that, managing the tasks that could be managed with one arm and improvising the rest. And the shoulder improved slowly, not quickly, and the roof section stayed half repaired because she could not get back up there and would not ask someone to do it. This was the second concealment, and it was larger than she understood yet. Silas came by on the Friday of that week. She had known he was likely to come soon. He'd sent a message 2 days before saying he'd be in her area checking on a boundary line. And she had spent those 2 days practicing the art of moving in a way that did not reveal the shoulder, which was harder than it sounded, because pain has its own vocabulary, and it shows up in the way people hold themselves, the way they reach for things, the small hesitations before movements that should be instinctive. She had the coffee ready when she heard his wagon. She poured the cups before he came in, which meant she had the good arm doing the work, and her back to the door when he entered, and she turned carefully when she heard his step, and handed him his cup. And the handoff was fine. She thought she had it. She thought that for approximately 7 minutes. They were talking about the roof. She had mentioned it neutrally, as a task she'd attended to. And he asked about the repair, and she said she'd managed part of it, and he asked which part, and she described the section, and he frowned slightly because he knew roofs, and he knew that section was the harder part of the job. And he said, "You get up on the roof yourself in this cold?" "It needed doing," she said. He looked at her. Not a long look, not a dramatic one, just a look that had in it the quality of attention she had come to recognize as specifically his, the kind that gathered information quietly, without performance. "How's your shoulder?" he said. The coffee cup was very still in her hand. "Fine." "Margaret." "It's fine, Silas." "Which one is it?" She did not answer immediately. The silence was its own answer. He put his cup down on the table with the care of a man who was arranging his thoughts, and then he looked at her across the kitchen with an expression she had not seen on him before and could not immediately name. "You were on the stable roof by yourself in December," he said, "and you hurt your shoulder, and you've been managing it alone for—" He paused. "How many days?" "4," she said. She said it the way she said most things she didn't want to say, directly, without softening, because softening felt worse than the plain truth. 4 days. He said it back without inflection. "It's improving." "I'm sure it is." He picked up his cup again and then put it back down. "Can I see it?" "No." "Can I at least— Will you show me how you're reaching? Reach for that cup again." She reached for the cup with her right hand, and the slight catch in the motion was visible even to herself, and she watched him see it, and she felt something she hadn't expected, which was shame. Not the shame of weakness. She knew the difference. This was the particular shame of having been found out in a position she'd placed herself in through stubbornness she couldn't entirely defend. Silas was quiet for a moment. He didn't look at her with pity. That, she thought, she could have deflected without trouble. He looked at her with something more difficult, which was concern stripped of any softness, the kind of plain-faced worry that didn't give her anywhere comfortable to redirect. "Why didn't you send for me?" he said. Because it was my roof, she said, and my decision, and I managed. You managed 4 days with a bad shoulder doing ranch work in December, he said. Yes, I can see that you managed. A pause. That's not actually the question. The kitchen was quiet except for the wind, which had developed an opinion about December that matched no one's preferences. Margaret looked at her coffee. She thought about all the careful, measured reasons she'd had for handling it herself. The self-sufficiency, the pride, the anger that had made her climb up there in the first place. She thought about Eleanor's voice, and Ruth's bread, and Dora's pan, and how the accumulated weight of all of it had driven her to a decision that could have been genuinely bad. People have been telling me for years what I can't manage, she said, finally. I've been making a point of proving otherwise. Silas looked at her for a long time. I know, he said. I know that. He turned his cup once on the table. But there's proving you can manage, and then there's proving it to people who aren't there to see it. The only person in any danger from that was you. The truth of it landed flatly, without ceremony. She couldn't dispute it. Accepting help isn't the same as proving them right, he said. That's the part that gets mixed up. She didn't say anything. He wasn't wrong, and she knew he wasn't wrong, and the particular frustration of being correctly identified by someone else is that you can't argue with the identification, you can only sit in it. Let me look at the shoulder, he said, and then I'm going to finish the roof. Silas? Margaret, let me look at the shoulder. She turned in her chair. He crossed the kitchen and she felt his hands, careful, impersonal, the hands of someone who had set enough bones and wrapped enough injuries on a working ranch to know what he was doing. Move along her shoulder and upper arm, testing, and she held herself very still and breathed and tried not to notice how long it had been since anyone had touched her with simple, practical kindness. It's a bad wrench, he said. Nothing broken. Another week, maybe 10 days. It'll settle. I know, she said. I assessed it myself. I know you did. He stepped back. You're still going to need help with the troughs for the next few days. She opened her mouth and he said preemptively, I'm not doing it because I think you can't. I'm doing it because you're hurt and it's cold and the cattle need water. Those are facts. She closed her mouth. He finished the roof that afternoon. She watched him from the stable yard, tracking his progress, and she noticed that he worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime doing physical labor without drama. And she noticed that he didn't do it in the way of someone performing capability for an audience. And she noticed that she was not uncomfortable with him being on her property doing work on her buildings, which surprised her, because she had been uncomfortable with that in various ways for 7 years. She went inside and made a meal. Nothing elaborate. She had one usable arm and limited patience, but something hot, because the cold outside was genuine and the work was real, and it seemed the right thing to do. He came in when the light started going. He washed up at the basin and sat down and ate without making a production of it, and they talked about the cattle, and the ongoing freeze, and a story he'd heard from a neighbor about a collapsed fence line and a runaway bull that was genuinely funny in the way only livestock disasters could be funny to people who understood them. At some point, in the middle of something ordinary, Margaret said, Eleanor came to see me 3 weeks ago. Silas set his fork down, slowly. He looked at the table for a moment before looking at her. I know, he said. She blinked. You know. She told me. After. His jaw moved slightly. She told me she'd come to speak with you. She described it as a responsible conversation. His voice was very level, but something underneath the level was not. I told her she owed you an apology. She told me she was looking out for my well-being. I told her there was a difference between those two things. Margaret looked at him. You didn't tell me. I was trying to decide how. He met her eyes. I wanted to see you first. See how you were. I half thought you might not mention it. I wasn't going to, she said. And then I did. He nodded. What did you think of what she said? I thought she was afraid for you, Margaret said. Underneath the rest of it, the fear was real. Something in Silas's expression shifted. She was, he said quietly. She and her mother were very close. She took it. She's still taking it hard, and she... He stopped. Began again. She worries that I'm going to get hurt, that I'll want something that turns out to be something different. I understand the worry. I don't accept the conclusion she drew from it. What conclusion was that? He looked at her steadily. That I'm not clear-eyed enough to know what I want. The kitchen held the warmth of the meal between them. Outside, the freeze continued its long argument with the territory. Are you? Margaret asked. Clear-eyed? Yes, he said. Simply, without elaboration, the way he said most things he was certain of. Are you? She thought about 4 days of managed pain and an unfinished roof and the exhaustion of being very stubborn about the wrong things. She thought about what it had felt like to have him read her shoulder in the particular way of someone who was paying genuine attention, and what it had felt like to eat a meal with another person and hear a story about a runaway bull and laugh without planning to. I'm working on it, she said. It was not the answer he might have wanted. He accepted it without pushing, which was the answer she needed from him. He left before dark, mindful of the roads. At the door he turned and said, Tomorrow morning I'll be here before first light to break the troughs. I know you'll argue about it. I'm asking you not to. She looked at him. She thought about all the arguments she had prepared, all the deflections she kept in ready inventory, all the ways she knew to refuse things she actually needed. All right, she said. He nodded once and went out into the December dark. She closed the door and stood with her back to it for a moment, in the quiet of her house that had been quiet for 7 years. And she thought about the word all right, and how long it had been since she'd said it without either obligation or performance behind it. He was there before 5 the next morning. She heard the wagon on the frozen track and was already up, already dressed, already boiling water for coffee, because she was not a woman who made people wait. They broke the troughs together in the lantern-lit dark without speaking much, and when they came inside for coffee, their hands were numb from the cold and they wrapped them around their cups and let the warmth do its work. Tell me something about Robert, Silas said, out of the nowhere that sometimes produces the most necessary things. She looked at him over her cup. Why? Because you talk about the ranch and the work and the practical things, he said. I want to know what you miss. No one had asked her that in 7 years. Not once. People asked how she was managing, how the ranch was doing, whether she needed anything, whether she was keeping up with the accounts. No one had asked what she missed. His voice in the mornings, she said after a moment. He was a terrible conversationalist at breakfast. He'd sit there half asleep and say things that made no sense, and then look surprised when I pointed it out. But the house had sound. There was sound in it that was someone else's. Silas nodded. Clara used to read at night, he said, aloud, even when I was already half asleep. She said it helped her retain things. I didn't hear most of it, but the sound of it. He stopped. Yes, Margaret said. They understood each other without finishing the sentence, which was its own kind of conversation, possibly the most important kind. The days between Christmas and New Year's were the coldest the territory had seen in Margaret's memory of it, and she was grateful. With a gratitude she examined carefully for anything unhealthy and found mostly clean, that Silas had arranged quietly with 2 of his hands to assist with her troughs and her morning feeding for the worst stretch of it. She paid them. She fed them. She did not pretend the arrangement was comfortable for her pride, but she stopped pretending that pride was the same thing as strength, because 7 years of evidence was accumulating against that particular belief. On the last day of December, she was sitting at her kitchen table in the early dark, working on the ranch accounts for the year, when she heard a knock, an actual knock, with appropriate notice and appropriate restraint, and opened the door to find Silas standing on her porch, holding a small parcel, and looking slightly less certain of himself than usual, which was noticeable because usual was quite certain. I didn't want the year to end, he said, without saying something directly. Margaret stepped back from the door. He came in. He set the parcel on the table. It was wrapped in brown paper and turned out to contain 2 jars of preserved fruit and a small block of beeswax for her saddle leather, which were practical items that she recognized as his version of flowers, the gift of a man who expressed care in useful things. And then he stood in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, in the way he had stood the first morning at her gate, and she noticed that he was nervous. She found his nervousness more reassuring than confidence would have been. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what this is, he said. I'm not 20 years old. I don't know the right words for it, and I'm not going to perform as though I do. A breath. What I know is that I've been taking the long way around for 2 months, and I'm not sorry about it, and I'd like to keep doing it, if that's something you'd consider. The lamp on the table threw its light. The last night of December waited outside. Margaret looked at this man, His careful words and his imperfect certainty, and the small block of beeswax that was the most sincere gift she'd received in years. And she thought about Eleanor saying, "You don't start over at 53." And she thought about Ruth's bread and Dora's pan, and then she stopped thinking about all of them, because none of them were in this kitchen. "I'd consider it," she said. He let out a breath. Just slightly, just enough to be visible. "The shoulder," he said. "When it's healed. Will you let me help with the things that need two people? Not the things you can manage, just the ones that actually need two." "If you'll let me do the same for you," she said. He thought about that for a moment. "That's fair?" "Yes," she said. "It is." They had coffee. They saw the new year in without ceremony, the way two people see it in when they have lived long enough to know that the calendar changing doesn't owe them anything, and the meaning of a moment is made by the people in it rather than the date on the wall. He left at close to midnight. At the door, in the cold dark of the first minutes of a new year, he said, "I'll be by Thursday." "I know," she said. She closed the door. She stood in her kitchen, in the house that had been silent for 7 years, and she listened to the quiet, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, the quiet felt like something she was choosing rather than something that had chosen her. Her shoulder still ached. The roof section he'd repaired would need checking in the spring. The accounts on the table were not finished. The cold outside was not interested in her personal revelations, and the cattle would need feeding in 4 hours regardless of what had just happened in this kitchen. Everything was exactly as difficult as it had always been, and she stood in it and felt, underneath all the difficulty, something that was not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word, too light, but something that had the weight and texture of a thing that was real. Something that had been there all along, maybe, waiting for her to stop arguing with it long enough to notice. She did not sleep well that night either, but this time, lying in the dark, listening to the cold settle into the walls of her house, the sleeplessness had a different quality. Not the anxious turning of a woman fighting her own mind, more like the wakefulness of someone sitting with something new, turning it over slowly, not yet ready to put it down. Outside, the Montana winter held the land in its long grip, indifferent and immense, the same as it had always been. Inside, something had changed. She wasn't sure yet what it would cost her. She had a feeling it would cost her something. It always did, the things worth having. Eleanor was not finished, she suspected. The town was not finished. There were conversations ahead that she could already see the shape of, arguments she would have to have, and positions she would have to hold, and she was 53 years old with a wrenched shoulder and a half-healed pride and no map for any of it. She closed her eyes. She thought about a man who brought beeswax for saddle leather because he paid attention to what she actually needed. She thought about two people in the lantern dark before dawn, breaking ice from water troughs, not talking much, not needing to. She thought, well, here we are then. And she let herself sleep. January in Montana was not a month that cared about personal developments. It had its own agenda, brutal, consistent, without negotiation. And it applied that agenda equally to the hopeful and the heartbroken and everyone in between. The cold that had settled over the valley at the end of December did not lift with the new year. It dug in. Margaret's shoulder healed on the schedule she had predicted, which was the one thing in her life that winter that proceeded according to plan. By the second week of January, she had most of her range back, enough to manage the morning work without the visible hesitation that Silas had read so clearly. And she was grateful for the recovery in the particular way she was grateful for things, quietly, without ceremony, filing it under the category of problems resolved and moving on to the next one. Silas came on Thursdays, as he had said he would. Sometimes he came on other days as well, when there was a reason, or when there was something that functioned as a reason. He was good at finding the latter. A question about the South Road conditions that he could have sent a message about. A piece of equipment he thought she might be able to use that turned out to fit her needs almost exactly, as though he'd looked at the situation and measured it. A morning when he happened to have time before his own work demanded him, which she knew his mornings well enough by now to know was not as casual as it sounded. She stopped examining the reasons and started simply expecting him, which was its own kind of decision, arrived at without announcement. The town's reaction to the new year was to update its position. The early response had been curiosity edged with concern, a watching and waiting quality, the communal equivalent of someone standing near a situation in case they were needed to intervene. January moved that into something more active. People had apparently conferred over the holiday gatherings and arrived at a collective understanding that something was actually happening between the widow Ashford and Silas Whitmore, and that this was not going to resolve itself into a simple misunderstanding, and that therefore a more organized response was warranted. Margaret first felt the new organization when she went into town for supplies in the second week of January. The grain exchange was run by a man named Caldwell, who had always been straightforwardly decent with her. No widow discount, no excessive chivalry, just business conducted on mutual terms. He was still decent when she came in, but there was a new quality to his decency, a slightly over-careful politeness that she recognized as the behavior of a person who knew something they weren't saying and was compensating for not saying it by being very courteous about everything else. She bought her supplies. At the door, almost as she was leaving, Caldwell said, "You know people talk, Mrs. Ashford. I'm sure you know that." He said it looking at the counter rather than at her, which told her he was uncomfortable with the message but had committed to delivering it. "It's just, people know Silas Whitmore. He's well regarded here. His family's been in the valley a long time. People want—" He stopped. "People want good things for him." "I'm sure they do," Margaret said. "They just want to know—" Another stop. "That things were appropriate." She looked at him for a moment. "Appropriate," she repeated. He looked up then, briefly, and she could see that he heard how it sounded and was not entirely comfortable with how it sounded, but had committed to the community position and couldn't easily back away from it without losing more face than he was willing to lose in a grain exchange on a January morning. "Thank you for the supplies," she said, and left. She drove home on the frozen road with her jaw set and the particular silence of a woman thinking with enough focus that she had nothing left over for language. And when she got back to the ranch, she unloaded the supplies and went inside and sat at the kitchen table and tried to be fair to what had just happened. The town's concern was not entirely without basis. She knew that. Silas was one of them in a way she was not, entirely. She had come to this valley as Robert's wife 23 years ago and had earned her place in it, but it was a different kind of belonging than the belonging of a family that had been here for 2 generations. They were protective of him. That was not villainous. It was the kind of protectiveness that communities had for their own, and it was not directed at her specifically so much as it was directed at the situation, which made it harder to argue with and in some ways harder to bear. What she could not make fair, try as she might, was the shape of the concern itself. If Silas had been seen calling on a widow woman in her 30s, she did not believe the conversations at the grain exchange would have the same quality. If the widow had been younger, prettier, less established in her own right, and therefore less threatening to whatever order people thought they were maintaining, she suspected the town's concern would have expressed itself differently, or not at all. The concern was not really about Silas's well-being. It was about something older and more stubborn. The belief that women past a certain age had used up their allotment of legitimate desire, and anyone who didn't understand that was a complication to be managed. She sat with this until she was sure of it, and then she put it in the category of things she had determined and moved on, because sitting with injustice past the point of understanding, it was not a useful activity on a working ranch in January. 2 days later, Eleanor came again. This time she knocked. Margaret noted the concession and opened the door. Eleanor came in without being invited, which partially canceled the knock, but she was wearing an expression that was different from the first visit, less rehearsed, more genuinely uncertain, which was harder to respond to than the controlled version had been. She sat down at the kitchen table without being asked, which was still presumptuous, and she looked at her hands for a moment before she looked at Margaret. "My father spoke with me," she said, "after my first visit." "I know," Margaret said. "He told me." Eleanor looked up. Something moved across her face. "What did he say? If you don't mind." "That you owed me an apology, and you disagreed with him." A pause. Eleanor's jaw worked slightly. "I told him I had been direct but not unreasonable." "You walked into my home without knocking," Margaret said, "and told me I had misread a situation and misused a man's grief, in my own kitchen." She kept her voice even. Not warm, not cruel, just factual, the way she kept her ranch accounts, in plain numbers, without opinion. That's a particular kind of message to deliver without being invited. Eleanor looked at the table. "I know," she said quietly. The word cost her something. Margaret could see it. I'm not going to tell you your concern for your father isn't genuine, Margaret said. It clearly is, and I understand it. What I will tell you is that it came out wrong, very wrong, and I'd like you to understand why. Eleanor looked up. She was not a stupid woman. That had been clear from the first visit. She was sharp, perceptive, and if her reasoning was flawed, it was not because of a lack of intelligence, but because of the emotional weight she was carrying it under. She was listening now, which was different from the first time. Your father is 57 years old, Margaret said. He ran a successful ranch for 30-odd years through conditions that would have ended most people. He raised children, managed men, made decisions in circumstances that didn't allow for error. He buried his wife. He rebuilt his life. She paused. And you came to tell me he wasn't thinking clearly, because of me. Eleanor's expression was complicated and difficult to read and probably honest because of that. I was afraid, she said. I am afraid. He's not the kind of man who says what he's feeling. When my mother was dying, he kept working. He kept the whole ranch running, and he sat with her every night, and he never once told any of us how bad it was, because that was how he protected us. And I worry about that. I worry about what he doesn't say. Margaret looked at her. That's a fair thing to worry about. But the answer to that worry is to talk to him, not to come here and tell the woman he's been spending time with that she's misreading the situation. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the January wind moved against the house, persistent and directionless. He seems... Eleanor stopped, started again. He came to dinner last week. He seemed different, not in a way I can easily describe, just... She shook her head slightly. I haven't seen him like that in a long time, maybe since before my mother got sick. Margaret didn't say anything. She waited to see where Eleanor was going. I don't know what to do with that, Eleanor said. It would be easier if I didn't like what I saw. But I did, and I don't know what to do with it. It was the most honest thing Eleanor had said in either visit. Possibly the most honest thing she was capable of saying on this subject, at this point, in this kitchen. Margaret recognized it as such. You don't have to do anything with it right now, Margaret said. You can take some time. Eleanor looked at her. Are you always like this? Like what? This, measured, about things that ought to make you angry. I was angry, Margaret said. I'm not anymore. It wasn't a useful thing to stay in. She paused. I found that most anger is a signal. You read the signal and then you put it down, if you can. Eleanor considered that for a moment. I don't know if I can do that. Nobody can, all the time, Margaret said. I can't either, but you practice. Eleanor left 20 minutes later, without the hard certainty she'd arrived with either time, which was the closest thing to progress available in late January in a Montana kitchen with the wind coming in under the door, and two women who were not going to be easy with each other for a while yet. Silas came on Thursday, and Margaret told him about Eleanor's visit, and he was quiet in a way that had several things in it, relief and guilt, and the complex emotion of a parent watching an adult child struggle with something he couldn't fix for her. She's not wrong to be protective, he said. She's wrong about where she aimed it. I know, Margaret said. I told her the same thing, approximately. He looked at her. How'd she take it? Better than the first time. He let out a breath. He stopped, tried again. She was very close to her mother, and Clara was sick for a long time before anyone named it that. Eleanor managed a lot of that, the practical side, while I was managing the ranch and trying not to see what I was seeing. She carried a lot that she shouldn't have had to carry alone. He turned his cup. I think she's afraid that if I move forward with something, it means what her mother had wasn't. He stopped. That it becomes less, Margaret said. Yes. It doesn't work that way. I know that. He looked at her. I don't know if she does yet. Margaret thought about Robert, about the particular way grief evolved over 7 years. Not into something smaller, but into something you could carry differently, that changed shape without changing weight. She thought about the fact that she had loved Robert Ashford for 23 years, and his gate latches still defeated him, and she still reached for things to tell him sometimes when something happened that he would have found interesting, and none of that had diminished by 1 degree. Tell her, Margaret said. Not what I just said. Tell her something that's yours. Something about her mother that Eleanor might not know you held on to. Silas looked at her for a long time. He stopped. That's a harder thing than it sounds. I know, she said. Most things worth doing are. February arrived with a brief thaw that felt like a promise and was actually a deception. The temperature climbed for 3 days and then crashed back below zero with extra intention, as if the thaw had simply been gathering momentum for a harder freeze. Margaret had seen this pattern before and was not deceived by it, and she used the 3 warmer days to do the outdoor maintenance she'd been queuing, and she was glad she had when the freeze returned. It was during the thaw that the 3rd community ambassador arrived. This one was different from the others. His name was George Aldrich, and he was the oldest man in the valley who was still mobile and present at community functions. In his late 70s, a former rancher, with the compressed dignity of a man who had survived enough winters that he had stopped spending energy on things that didn't matter. He arrived on horseback, which at his age was either stubbornness or principle or both, and he tied his horse at her gate and came up the path with a cane he didn't lean on much. She had met him a few times over the years. She liked him in the way you liked someone who had clearly decided that the remaining time was too valuable to waste on politeness that substituted for honesty. She brought him inside and gave him coffee and waited. I hear you and Silas Whitmore have been spending time together, he said. Yes, she said. People are talking about it. I know. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup the same way Silas did, and she noted that without knowing what to do with the noting. They say you're both too old for that kind of thing, he said. Starting over, all that. They do, she said. What do you think? He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had buried a wife and seen children grow and watched the territory change around him for the better part of 8 decades. I think, he said carefully, that most of the people saying it are younger than you are. And there's a particular kind of ignorance that comes with being young enough to think you know how it feels to be where you are. Margaret looked at him. I was 58 when my wife passed, he said. Eliza. 40 years we were married. Everyone told me I'd live out my years quietly, and I thought they were right, and I spent 2 years being right about it. And then I met a woman named Helen who argued with me about the price of cattle, and I thought there might be some years left worth making something of. He paused. We had 11 good years. She went in 78. I'm sorry, Margaret said. I'm not. He said it plainly, without sentimentality. I almost didn't. That's what I'm telling you. I almost let other people's certainty substitute for my own. He picked up the coffee cup. People your age telling you what's possible. They don't know. They haven't been here yet. It was the first time anyone in the valley had said to her, plainly and from a place of authority, that the opinions arrayed against her were opinions, not facts. Not facts about life or age or the geography of feeling. Just opinions held by people who were working from theory rather than experience. She sat with it quietly for a moment. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. Just don't let them do to you what I almost let them do to me. He drank his coffee. Silas Whitmore is a good man. I've known him 20 years. You seem like a woman who knows her own mind. The rest of it, he set down the cup. The rest of it is noise. He left the way he'd come, on horseback, with his cane across the saddle, and Margaret stood at the window watching him go and felt something in her chest that was not warmth exactly, but was something adjacent. The feeling of being seen clearly by someone who had earned the right to look. That conversation shifted something in her, not dramatically. She was not a woman of dramatic internal shifts, having spent too many years in work that required steady incremental movement rather than grand gestures. But something settled. Some last argumentative voice that she'd been hosting rent-free for months went quiet, or at least quieter, and in the space it left behind, she found she could think more clearly about what she actually wanted. She wanted Silas. That was plain. Not to be rescued by him, not to be absorbed into his life at the cost of her own, not to surrender the 7 years of work and hard-won competence and the specific shape of a life she had built with her own decisions. She wanted what they had been building since October. The bench silences and the honest conversations, and the shared labor and the surprising comfort of another person who understood grief and work in the same proportions she did. And she wanted it openly, not as something conducted quietly on the margins of other people's comfort, not as something she justified or apologized for, or framed in terms that made it easier for everyone else to accept. She wanted it as what it was: two capable, imperfect, not young adults who had each survived enough to know what mattered and were choosing to spend their remaining seasons on something real. The question was what that looked like in practice, what it meant for the ranch, what it meant for the particular independence she had spent 7 years defending with something approaching ferocity. She thought about it for 2 weeks. She thought about it while feeding cattle and breaking ice from troughs, and working on the accounts, and making 3 trips to town that all produced some version of the same careful sideways assessment from people who didn't know they were helping her make up her mind. And then Silas came on a Thursday in late February, when the freeze had finally and genuinely begun to consider loosening its grip, and they were sitting at her kitchen table with coffee, and he said, "I want to talk about what we're doing." "All right," she said, not in the way that requires a particular kind of answer." He turned his cup. "I just think we've been moving carefully around the edges of something for 4 months, and I'd rather we talked about the thing directly." "The thing directly," she said. "I want a future with you," he said. "I'm not sure of every shape that takes, but that's the direction I'm in. And I want to know if you're in the same direction." He met her eyes. "No pressure behind the question. I mean that. I just think we're past the point where not asking it is a kindness." Margaret looked at him across the table. The man who had shown up with a roll of wire at her gate in October and had been taking the long way around ever since, who brought beeswax for saddle leather and who laughed with his whole face, and who had sat next to her in the December dark breaking ice from water troughs without making it seem like anything other than what it was, which was just 2 people doing the work that needed doing. "My ranch stays mine," she said. "That's not negotiable. The title, the decisions, the operation, those stay with me." He nodded. "I know that. I wouldn't have it any other way. And I'll help with yours when you need it, and you'll help with mine when I need it, and neither of us asks permission for those decisions or makes them feel smaller than they are by calling them favors." "Agreed. And when people talk," she paused, "and they will talk more than they have been, I want us to be in agreement that we don't manage ourselves according to what they're comfortable with." "Agreed," he said again, without hesitation, which was the answer that mattered most, and the one she hadn't been entirely sure of until she heard it. She looked at him for a moment longer. "Then yes," she said, "I'm in the same direction." He let out a breath and picked up his coffee cup, and she picked up hers, and they sat in the kitchen in the last of February's cold light, and it was not a dramatic moment. The house did not transform. The wind outside had no opinion. Her hands were still cold, and the shoulder still ached in the mornings, and the cattle still needed feeding in an hour. But something was different. Something had been named that had been going around unnamed for months, and the naming of it changed the weight of it, made it something she could carry in the open instead of in the guarded interior where she'd been keeping it. They talked practically for the next hour, what the spring would look like for both operations, where the shared help would make the most difference, what needed coordination, and what could stay separate. It was the conversation of 2 people who were going to run ranches together without running one ranch, which was a different and more complicated thing that required actual planning rather than sentiment. She walked him to the door when he left, which she didn't always do. He put his hat on and turned at the threshold and said, "I should tell you something that Eleanor said when I told her I was going to talk to you today." "What did she say?" A pause. "She said to tell you that she'd been thinking about what you told her, about the signal and putting it down." He looked slightly amused and slightly moved, which was an expression she had come to recognize as belonging specifically to his relationship with his daughter. "She said she was working on it." Margaret stood in the cold doorway for a moment. Something adjusted in her assessment of Eleanor Whitmore. Not a dramatic revision, but a small, genuine one. Working on it was not nothing. Working on it was, in fact, the only honest answer anyone could give to the hardest things. "Tell her I heard that," Margaret said. He nodded and went out to his horse, and she watched him go in the way she'd watched him go since October, with the awareness that watching him leave had become categorically different from watching everyone else leave, in a way that she no longer tried to examine or explain or reduce to something more comfortable. The first signs of coming spring arrived in early March, not warmly, not generously, but in the tentative way of a season that was testing whether winter had genuinely finished, checking the temperature carefully before committing. The ground was still frozen beneath the surface, but the top layer was softening by midday. The cattle moved differently, with the restlessness of animals that could feel the season changing before it changed. Margaret felt it too, in the particular way she felt all transitions in the land, not with sentiment, but with a physical attentiveness that came from 23 years of working with weather rather than against it. She knew the signs. She knew what was coming. Spring meant work that was different from winter work, but not less demanding. It meant moving the herd back to the far pasture, assessing what the freeze had done to the fence lines, checking the soil in the kitchen garden, beginning the calculation of what the year's operation required, and what it would produce, and what the gap between those numbers meant. She went through the accounts in the first week of March, and the numbers were what they were, honest and difficult, and requiring the kind of decision she'd been making alone for 7 years. The ranch was solvent, not prosperous. It had been solvent, not prosperous, for most of the years she'd run it, which was the condition of most Montana ranches, and was not a catastrophe, only a constant management problem. She was going over the cattle figures when she found the error. It wasn't a large error, and it wasn't a new one. She found the original calculation mistake when she traced it back, a small miscount from the previous September that had propagated through the fall numbers and into the winter feed estimates. The mistake was hers. She had made it in September, in the week after the fence repair, when her attention had been divided by things that had nothing to do with cattle counts and everything to do with apple preserves and bench silences and a man who came from the northeast by the long way. She sat looking at the error for a long time. Then she corrected it and updated the figures that followed from it, and the correction made the numbers slightly worse than she'd thought, and she adjusted her spring planning accordingly. Then she put the ledger down and sat in the kitchen and let herself think about what the error meant. It meant she was human. It meant that September had gotten to her in ways she hadn't fully accounted for. It meant the accounts had a small gap she hadn't known about and had to address. It also meant that the year could still work, which it could, with some adjustments she already knew how to make. She thought about telling Silas, not to ask for help. The numbers were manageable and the decision had already been made, but because the idea of telling him had become, without her fully noticing, the default response to things she wanted to think through aloud. In 7 years she had had no one to think things through aloud with, and had trained herself out of the desire for it, and now the desire was back, and it felt strange and necessary and uncomfortable all at once. She sent him a message that said she'd found an error in the fall cattle count and had corrected it, and that it affected the spring numbers somewhat, and that she'd tell him about it Thursday. He sent back a message that said, "I've made the same kind of error. Last year, spring lambing count cost me 2 months of recalculation." Thursday. She read it twice. Then she folded it and set it in the kitchen drawer where she kept things she wanted to keep and went back to work. On Thursday, she told him about the numbers and he listened and looked at them and said, "Have you thought about the east pasture for the expanded summer herd?" And they talked through it for an hour. And by the end, the plan was better than the one she'd made alone. Not because he was smarter about it than she was, but because two people looking at a problem found angles that one person missed, and the combination of their particular knowledge, her land specifics, his broader operational experience, made the thinking better. She noticed this. She noticed that she didn't resent it, which was the thing she'd been most afraid of. She had been afraid that including another person in the decision she'd made alone for 7 years would feel like a reduction, a loss of the authority she'd fought for. Instead, it felt like the difference between carrying something across a field by yourself and carrying it with someone else. The load was the same, but your hands were free to do other things. She didn't say any of this out loud. It didn't require saying, but she sat with it for several days after, in the evenings when the work was done and the house was quiet, and she thought about what it meant that she had spent 7 years making herself not want this, and that she had done it so successfully she'd almost believed it. Almost. The Valley's response to the increasingly obvious situation shifted again in March, this time in a direction she hadn't entirely anticipated. The sharp-edged concern of January and the careful sideways assessments of February began to develop a different quality, something less like intervention and more like observation, the way a community watches something they've decided they can't stop and are in the process of reclassifying from a problem into a fact. Old George Aldrich, she heard, had apparently expressed himself on the subject at Caldwell's grain exchange, in terms that Caldwell described to her, with the look of a man recounting something he could neither confirm nor dispute with authority, as pretty direct. She didn't ask for specifics. She could imagine them. Dora Calloway came by with another borrowed item, a pot this time, returned with a pie inside it, which was either an apology in pastry form or just a pie, and Margaret accepted it as both possibilities at once. The town was not won over. She didn't expect it to be won over, and she didn't especially need it to be. What she needed was for the active interference to subside into the passive acceptance that communities usually arrived at when they ran out of more productive options, and that was beginning, slowly, unevenly, to happen. Eleanor, she heard from Silas, had been quieter on the subject since February. Not warm. Eleanor was not going to become warm on this matter in the span of a few months, possibly not in the span of a few years, and Margaret had settled her expectations accordingly. But quieter. Which was different from agreement and was still, for now, enough. On the last Thursday of March, Silas arrived in the late morning with something different in his manner. Not nervous exactly, but carrying something he hadn't arrived with before. She noticed it when he came through the door, in the particular way he moved into the room, and she waited while they had their coffee and talked about the spring work. And eventually there was a pause, and in the pause he said, "I want to ask you something." She put her cup down. "I'm not going to do this elaborately," he said. "That's not who I am, and it's not who you are. I'm just going to say the thing directly." He looked at her across the table. "I want to marry you, Margaret, if that's something you'd consider." The kitchen was very still. She had thought about this possibility. She was a woman who thought about possibilities and prepared for them, and she had recognized some weeks ago that this was a direction they were moving and had considered what she thought about it, carefully and honestly, in the way she considered all important decisions. She had a position on it. She had thought through the position and tested it and was reasonably confident in it. What she had not prepared for was the particular way he said it, direct and not performative, and clearly frightened in the plain, undramatic way of a man who was doing something that mattered and knew it and was doing it anyway. "My ranch stays mine," she said. "Title, operation, every decision." "Yes," he said. "I already agreed to that." "I know," she said. "I'm saying it again so we're clear that it's a condition, not a preference." "It's not a condition I have any objection to," he said. "I want an equal partner. I'm not looking for someone to absorb." She looked at him. "I know you're not," she said. "That's part of why the answer is yes." Something moved across his face that she stored in the same place she kept the laugh and the long way around and the beeswax for saddle leather. The small inventory of things about this man that she had been quietly, carefully collecting since October, against some future need she hadn't named until now. "Yes," she said again, clearly, so there was no possibility of misunderstanding. "I'll marry you." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, just there, solid and warm and without the posture of a grand gesture. Just a hand, on the table, on hers. She turned her hand over and held it. Outside, the last of the winter loosened its grip on the Montana ground, and somewhere in the near pasture a cow expressed an opinion about the warming temperature that neither of them paid attention to, and the spring, which had been threatening for weeks, finally and irreversibly arrived. They told no one immediately. That was not a strategy. It was simply that the morning after Silas asked and Margaret said yes, there was a fence line to walk on the south pasture where the thaw had revealed what the freeze had done to 3 of the older posts. And there were cattle to move. And there was a calculation about seed that needed finishing before the supplier's wagon came through on Friday. The world did not pause for personal developments. It never had. Margaret had understood this since she was young and had confirmed it comprehensively over the past 7 years. And so the morning after her life changed direction again, she fed her cattle and walked her fence and checked her numbers, and the news stayed between her and Silas and the quiet kitchen walls that had heard it made. It stayed that way for 11 days. The 11th day was a Sunday, and Silas rode over in the late morning with the particular expression of a man who had been sitting with something and had reached the point where sitting with it further was no longer productive. "Eleanor is coming for dinner next week," he said. "I think she should hear it from me before she hears it from someone else. The way things travel in this valley, someone else is probably 2 weeks away from knowing already." Margaret was at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she thought about Eleanor. The first visit, the second visit, the complicated expression in the kitchen in January, The message relayed through Silas in February about working on it. How do you think she'll take it? She asked. Badly, at first, he said, without hesitation. Then she'll think about it. Then she'll come around to something. I don't know exactly what, but she won't stay in the bad place forever. That's not who she is. You know her well, Margaret said. I know her like a father knows a daughter, he said, which means I know her mostly and understand her partially and still get surprised sometimes. He sat down. I think she's been preparing herself for something like this, even while she was resisting it. She's a practical woman. She saw what she saw at dinner in January. She's been thinking. Then tell her, Margaret said. Directly, not softened. He looked at her. That's your advice on most things. It's worked for most things, she said. He nodded and drank his coffee, and they talked through the spring cattle plan and the question of the shared fence line that ran between their two properties along the east boundary, which had been in moderate disrepair for years under the previous agreement between Silas and the ranch's owner before Margaret, and which now had a different kind of relevance. By the time he left, they had a working plan for the east line that was, on paper, just a practical arrangement between neighboring ranchers, and which was also something considerably more than that. Silas told Eleanor on Wednesday evening. Margaret was not there, which was the right decision. This was between a father and his daughter, and her presence would only have made Eleanor feel that the conclusion had already been organized without her, which would have been both true and counterproductive. Silas rode over Thursday morning, earlier than usual, and she met him at the door and read his face before he said a word. She cried, he said, stepping inside. Margaret waited. Not angry crying, he said. At least not mostly. He sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, and she put coffee in front of him and sat across from him. She said she'd been afraid it was coming and had told herself she was ready and discovered she wasn't, exactly. He looked at his hands. She asked me if I was certain. I said yes. She said, did I think her mother would have understood? He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. What did you tell her? Margaret said. I told her that her mother was the least sentimental person I'd ever loved, and that she would have wanted me to stop being sad before it became a habit I couldn't break. He looked up, and that she would have liked Margaret Ashford, probably more than she wanted to. Something compressed in Margaret's chest, not painfully, just firmly, the way something real feels when you encounter it. She didn't speak for a while after that, he said. Then she said she needed time to think. I told her she could have as much time as she needed and that I wasn't asking her permission, but that I wanted her to be part of this if she was willing. A pause. She said she'd think about it. That's all you can ask, Margaret said. I know. He picked up the coffee cup. She also said, at the door, leaving, she said to tell you that she heard you, about the signal. Margaret sat with that for a moment. It was an oblique message, delivered obliquely, through a father, at the door of a leaving, the way Eleanor communicated the things that cost her most. It was not warm. It was also not nothing. It was, in its particular way, Eleanor working on it in real time, and Margaret accepted it for what it was. Tell her I heard that too, Margaret said. The news spread through the valley the way most news did, not in a single moment, but through the accumulation of details that eventually assembled themselves into a conclusion no one could pretend not to have reached. Caldwell at the grain exchange heard it first, probably, because he heard most things first, and from there it moved in the usual directions. By the second week of April, Margaret could tell from the quality of people's greetings when she came to town that the knowing had become general. The reactions were varied, which she had expected. Some people were surprised and showed it. Some people were not surprised and showed that instead, with the slightly smug expression of those who had seen something coming and are gratified by the confirmation. Some people were uncomfortable and attempted to disguise the discomfort with excessive enthusiasm, which was in some ways the most tiring response to manage. A few people were simply glad. Old George Aldrich passed her on the main street, touched his hat brim and said, "Good," in the flat tone of a man who has made a prediction and been proven right and considers the matter settled. She appreciated the economy of it enormously. Dora Calloway came by with a pie that was unambiguously a pie this time, not an apology or a message. She sat in the kitchen and said, "I owe you something more honest than what I said in October." And then she said it, which was that she had been afraid on Margaret's behalf and had expressed that fear badly, in terms that weren't fair to her. It was not a comprehensive reckoning, but it was genuine, and Margaret accepted it as such. Ruth Ellery sent a note that was properly warm if slightly formal, as though she was still finding the appropriate tone for a situation she hadn't included in her original mental categories. Margaret wrote back with equal warmth and equal formality and considered the matter addressed. The one conversation she had been quietly preparing for, across several weeks, arrived in the third week of April when Eleanor came to her property for the first time. She had asked to come. That was the thing Margaret held on to in the days before the visit. Eleanor had asked, through Silas, if she could call on Margaret at her ranch. Not the other way around. Eleanor coming to her, on her ground, by request. It was a small thing and a significant one simultaneously. She came on a Tuesday morning. She tied her horse correctly at the gate and walked up the path and knocked. And Margaret opened the door and stepped back, and Eleanor walked in. She looked around the kitchen with the frank assessment of someone who had been imagining a place and was now comparing the imagination to the reality. Margaret let her look. There was nothing in the kitchen to hide and nothing to perform. It was a working kitchen in a working ranch house, with the accumulated evidence of 7 years of a woman running something by herself. The accounts on the table. The tools hung with a precision that was not aesthetics but efficiency. The saddle leather on the counter waiting for the beeswax she hadn't used yet. Eleanor sat down. Margaret made coffee. The silence was not comfortable, but it was honest, and honesty was the currency she preferred. "I want to tell you something," Eleanor said when the coffee was in front of them both. "And I want to say it right, which means I've been thinking about how to say it for about 3 weeks." "Take your time," Margaret said. Eleanor looked at her hands. "I came here in November and I said things that were... I said them because I was scared, and I organized the fear into something that sounded like sense, and it wasn't sense. It was just fear wearing reasonable clothing." She looked up. "What I said about women your age, about misreading things, it was wrong. Not just in how I said it, in what it assumed." A pause. "I think I said it because if I could make this something you'd done to my father, I didn't have to look at what was actually happening, which was that he was choosing something, on his own, and I wasn't the right person to stop it." Margaret looked at her across the kitchen table. Eleanor Whitmore was not a woman who found apology easy or comfortable. That was clear in every word, in the effort each one cost. She was doing it anyway. "I hear that," Margaret said. "Thank you for saying it." Eleanor nodded once. She picked up her coffee cup and then put it down. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Do you love him?" It was a direct question and deserved a direct answer, and Margaret gave it one. "Yes," she said, not in the way of someone who's decided to feel something, in the way of someone who looked up one day and found that she already did and couldn't undo it if she tried. Eleanor absorbed this. Something in her expression shifted. Not melting, not collapsing, just changing, the way a position changes when new information is genuinely received rather than just heard. "He's different," she said. "He's been different since October. I hated that I could see it at first. It was easier to be angry about the cause than to deal with what it meant." She looked out the window for a moment. "My mother would have said that was very typical of me." Something moved in Margaret unexpectedly, quick and quiet. "She sounds like she was honest with you." "Brutally," Eleanor said. A small, complicated smile. "I miss it. You don't know how much you rely on someone being brutally honest with you until it's gone." They sat in the kitchen for an hour and talked. Not easily, not without the occasional careful navigation of a subject that had several tender edges, but genuinely. Eleanor asked about the ranch and listened to the answers with the attention of someone who was revising a picture she'd been carrying. Margaret asked about Eleanor's husband's business and billings, and found that Eleanor had a dry, precise intelligence about commerce that she respected without reservation. They were not going to be easy friends. They were not going to be easy anything, but they were going to be something, and the something had more possibility in it than either of them had allowed for earlier in the winter. At the door, leaving, Eleanor said, "I'd like to come to the wedding, if that's acceptable." "It's more than acceptable," Margaret said. "It's wanted." Eleanor nodded. She walked to her horse with the composed efficiency she carried everywhere, and she mounted and rode out through the gate, and Margaret stood at the door and watched her go, and thought about all the ways a relationship could start wrong and still find its way to something worth having if enough people were willing to do the difficult, unglamorous work of changing their minds. The wedding was in June. Margaret had not wanted anything elaborate, which Silas had expected, and which the Valley, she suspected, had also expected, having read her correctly by that point, even if some of the readers had come to the assessment late. They arranged a small ceremony at the ranch, her ranch, which would remain her ranch, and which Silas had never once suggested otherwise, with the people who had earned the right to be there. George Aldrich came, leaning on his cane that he still didn't lean on much. The Henderson family came, Tom Sr. with his hat in his hands, and his oldest boy who'd first sent Silas to her fence in October, who had apparently worked out by now what his message had set in motion and wore the slightly dazed expression of a young man who had underestimated the consequences of a simple errand. Dora Calloway came with her husband, who was quieter than she was and seemed comfortable with this arrangement. A handful of others who had been decent, or who had been not decent and had found their way to decency, or who were simply neighbors in the plain sense of the word, which in a Montana valley meant something more than proximity. Eleanor stood beside her father. She had brought him a new hat for the occasion, which he wore with the slight self-consciousness of a man who was not accustomed to being looked at, and was managing it. She stood straight and watched the ceremony with the expression of someone doing a genuinely difficult thing competently, which Margaret had come to understand was Eleanor's highest register of emotional engagement, and which she respected accordingly. The ceremony was plain. A justice of the peace from town named Whitfield, who had married enough people over the years that he had the quality of a man who understood that the words were not the point and kept them brief. Margaret had worn her best dress, which was dark blue and practical, and which she had owned for 4 years and saw no reason to replace. Silas had worn his good coat, which fit him well, and which she had the thought, looking at him, had probably been cleaned and pressed by Eleanor, who would have done it because it needed doing, and because she loved her father, both things equally true, and neither one requiring acknowledgement. They said what needed to be said. Whitfield completed what needed to be completed. She was married. She stood in the June light on her own land that was still her own land, next to the man who had shown up with a roll of wire in October, and had been taking the long way around ever since, and she felt the particular texture of a moment that was not perfect. Her hands were calloused, and the day was warm enough to be uncomfortable in a good dress, and somewhere in the south pasture a cow was making a complaint that would need investigating before evening, and was real in the way that imperfect things were real, which was completely without apology. After the ceremony, people ate and talked, and Margaret moved through the gathering with the comfort of someone on her own ground, and Silas moved beside her with the ease of someone who had learned the shape of her company well enough that he could be next to her without crowding her, which remained one of the things she valued most about him, that specific fluency in her particular need for space. George Aldrich found her at one point near the fence and said, "You look like someone who made a good decision." "I did," she said. "So did he," the old man said. "Don't let anyone tell you the credit runs only one direction." She thought about that for a moment. 7 years of people defining her as a recipient, of help, of concern, of neighborly intervention, and this one old man who kept insisting on the bilateral nature of things. "Thank you, George," she said. "Don't thank me," he said for the second time. "Just keep going." She would. The first summer of the marriage was, in the plain sense of the word, work. They had 2 ranches running as separate operations that shared labor and equipment and decision-making in ways that needed to be developed as they went, because there was no map for this particular arrangement, and they were making it as they lived it. There were days when the coordination was efficient and satisfying, and days when it was frustrating and slow, and days when they disagreed, sometimes heatedly, about how a thing should be done. The disagreements were the things she'd been least prepared for and found most valuable. Silas had opinions, informed, experienced opinions, and he expressed them, and she had her own, and the process of working through the gap between those opinions was occasionally irritating and consistently productive. He was right more often than she wanted to admit about certain things, and she was right more often than he initially expected about certain others. And by the end of summer they had the shape of something that worked, not because it was smooth, but because they were both willing to be wrong when they were wrong, and to say so, which was harder than any physical labor either of them performed. Eleanor came for dinner in August, the second time, and it was different from the first. Not warm, still, not the uncomplicated warmth of a family that had never been complicated, but real. The kind of dinner where people say what they think and occasionally disagree, and nobody performs comfort they don't feel, and at the end of which Eleanor helped clear the table without being asked, which Margaret noted without comment, and which meant something she didn't attempt to quantify. In September, almost exactly a year after Silas had arrived at her gate with a roll of wire and an unexpected kindness, Margaret walked the northwest fence line in the early morning, the fence that had started everything. The posts they had set together, deep enough for the soft September ground, that had held through a Montana winter without complaint. She ran her hand along the top wire. It held firm. She stood there for a while, alone, which she still was sometimes, which she still needed to be sometimes, which had not changed, and which Silas understood without having to be told, because he needed it too. She stood in the September morning and looked at the land she had kept for 7 years through things that should have broken her and hadn't, and she thought about what had changed and what hadn't, and what she had learned across the year that had just passed. She had learned that asking for help was not the same as conceding defeat, but that she had been treating them as identical for long enough that unlearning it took real work and was not yet fully accomplished. She had learned that a community's opinion was not the same as a fact, and that the most confident voices were often speaking from the least experience of the thing they were certain about. She had learned that grief did not expire, that it did not mean a person was finished, that the people who thought those two things were the same had confused the presence of loss with the absence of future, which was an understandable error that was nonetheless wrong. She had learned that independence was not the same as isolation, and that she had been using one as cover for the other for longer than she wanted to examine too closely. And she had learned, this one slowly, imperfectly, still in progress, that being loved well by someone who saw you clearly was not a threat to who you were. It was more like a weather condition. It didn't change the landscape. It changed how the light fell on it. She walked back toward the house. Silas's horse was at the gate. He had come over early, as he often did on the mornings when his own operation didn't demand him first. She could see him through the kitchen window, moving around in the way of someone who knew where things were, which he did now, having learned the arrangement of her kitchen the same way he'd learned everything about her, quietly, attentively, without making a performance of the learning. She came through the gate and up the path and in through the door, and he looked up from the coffee he was making and said, "How's the fence?" "Good," she said. "Holding fine." "I thought it would," he said. "We set those posts right." We. The same word he'd used the first morning, in the same easy, unremarkable way. And she had thought then that it was notable, and she thought so now, a year later, with the additional weight of everything that word had turned out to mean. She hung her coat and sat down at her kitchen table. In her kitchen, in her house, on her land, and he put coffee in front of her and sat across from her, and the morning came in through the windows the way it always did, indifferent to personal history, simply light doing what light does. "The Henderson boy asked me yesterday," Silas said, "whether we'd take on his cousin's extra herd for the winter. The cousin's moving east." "How many head?" 22. She thought about it. The pasture space, the feed calculation, the additional work against the income it would generate. The east pasture could handle it if we finished the fence repairs before November. "That's what I thought," he said. "But I told him I'd talk to you first." She looked at him across the table, at this man who had taken the long way around since October of last year, and had never once made her feel that the long way was a cost he resented, who had set fence posts in soft ground and brought apple preserves on a Tuesday and beeswax for saddle leather because he paid attention to what she actually needed, who had told her, in December, in the dark of a frozen kitchen, that accepting help was not the same as proving people right, which was the truest thing anyone had said to her in 7 years, and which she was still, daily, learning how to believe. "Tell him yes," she said. Silas nodded. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Outside, the September morning continued its work. The cattle in the near pasture, the fence line holding against the distance, the land doing what it had always done, patient and indifferent and requiring everything she had, which she had always been willing to give it. She had been 53 years old when a man showed up at her gate with a roll of wire, and the whole town had been quietly certain that her story had reached its final chapter. They had been wrong. Not because the story had become simpler or easier or exempt from the ordinary costs of a life lived fully. It hadn't. The winters would keep coming. The cattle would keep needing feeding. The accounts would occasionally contain errors made in moments of distraction. The relationships that mattered would keep requiring the unglamorous daily work of maintenance. But she was here, in this kitchen, in this life, and the life was still going, and that was the only answer she had ever needed to give to everyone who had told her otherwise. The greatest thing she had ever done. Greater than keeping the ranch through 7 winters, greater than every negotiation at the grain exchange, greater than the roofs she had replaced and the fences she had set and the cattle she had kept alive in conditions that demanded everything, was simply refusing to agree that she was finished. She had opened the gate one more time. Everything else had followed from that.